This press conference concludes the 2011 Halifax International Security Forum. It's been an instructive and inspiring weekend for our participants and an important opportunity for leaders from around the world to learn from each other, share ideas, and put them into action. News was made, new ideas were born. Relationships among democratic nations were strengthened and renewed. It's hard to sum up 3 days of rich, substantive discussions in a word or two, but I'll try. To me, the themes running throughout this year's forum were cooperation and creativity. In a time of increasingly complex threats and decreasing military budgets, democratic nations and people with democratic values must work together in innovative ways to create a more secure world. International security is not only important to the decision makers and experts who gathered here, it is important to people everywhere, because security is the foundation for building a better world, strengthening democracy, creating opportunity, and promoting peace. That is the mission of Halifax. That mission doesn't end here. Halifax is more than this event. It is a global network of leaders who will go from here and continue to work together in the spirit of cooperation to make the world more secure. We'll be announcing new events and resources to help keep the conversation going and put cooperation into action. It is my privilege to introduce the individual who, more than anybody, made Halifax International Security Forum possible, Canada's Minister of National Defence, the Honourable Peter MacKay.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for all of your hard work and initiative and leadership for this great event. And I want to thank members of the press who are joining us here and who have been here throughout the weekend. As Peter mentioned, we're at the conclusion of the third annual Halifax International Security Forum, hosted here in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and what better place to bring people together to have this type of meaningful, substantive discussion. The value and the utility of the Halifax Forum draws leading thinkers from around the world together on Canadian shores to discuss the pertinent issues of our time. Over the past few days, we've covered a lot of ground, as was mentioned. We've tackled security issues as diverse and complex as nuclear proliferation, the economic challenges, of course, the Arab Spring, the rise of China, North American continental security, and much, much more. And we've internalized some of these lessons, and they can be applied, as Peter said, more broadly in the future. Clearly, this has been the most successful Halifax Security Forum yet, and there's more to come. Merci d'être venu vous joindre avec Peter et moi pour la conclusion du troisième Forum sur la sécurité internationale d'Halifax. Halifax a attiré les penseurs de raisons de partout dans le monde aux rivages canadiens pour discuter des questions les plus pertinentes de notre temps. Évidemment, ça a été le forum le plus réussi à dire. And when one looks around and looks at the breadth of the topics covered by the panel discussions and the wealth of experience that we had on hand this year, the speakers, the panelists, the participants were extraordinary. One knows that this is a unique event to North America and the world, quite frankly. And I've had the pleasure of discussing security matters with colleagues, a number of bilaterals from virtually every continent. And over the past number of days, we've had a great chance to be very up close and personal with decision makers from many of the countries, many of my counterparts in the defense and security world. And they've very much and expressed to me how much they enjoyed the warmth of the hospitality that they felt here in Halifax. And so I want to, in particular, express my appreciation to the City of Halifax and the Province of Nova Scotia, who are extraordinary hosts for the world in this instance, and as they have been for generations in this city on our shores. And that's what makes this forum truly unique, in my view, the secure feeling that people have here in Halifax. Thanks to Peter and his team, our media partner, Foreign Affairs Magazine, sponsors from around the globe, literally, and all the hard work and energy of conference organizers and volunteers, the forum has established itself as a significant event for those concerned with security and security issues as they relate in all corners of the globe. And we've had the good fortune and the pleasure to hear from such decision makers and thinkers as Leon Panetta, John McCain, who's been here 3 times, I should say, Mark Udall, Liam Fox, Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg, Ehud Barak, and numerous others, academics, journalists, policymakers, mandarins from Mexico to Mongolia. They've all said the same thing. This forum is their favorite. And Canadians also need to be aware of the praise that I've heard from the international community for the work that's being done and continues to be done by the Canadian Forces. And this is of particular place of pride, again, in a city like Halifax, that is so closely associated with the East Coast Fleet and with military participation overall. In Afghanistan, our forces held the ground. They held the fort in Kandahar, the most difficult and dangerous part of that country. And they helped to grow the number of students in school, of infrastructure, of clinics and vaccinations for children. In 2001, there were barely any girls going to school in Afghanistan. Today, 2011, there are over 2 million girls now attending school. And I just want to share something with you briefly. I was in Afghanistan just over a week ago. And I was there on a visit with members of the Canadian Forces, of course, but members of the Diplomatic Corps, some other prominent Canadians who were with us for Remembrance Day services. And it was a very poignant, emotional experience, to say the least, to be there with Silver Cross mothers and wounded soldiers who were returning for the first time since having lost loved ones and, in some cases, suffered grievous bodily harm. Being there at that granite monument, which will be transported back to Canada from the Kandahar airfield, was one of the most moving moments I've experienced in my lifetime. But the importance is to connect the sacrifice to the work that has been done, that has enabled girls to now go to school, that has enabled so much of the progress that has to be held and preserved now in that country. And Canada took a real leadership role in getting us there. They took a leadership role in Haiti, following the disastrous earthquake that occurred and devastated that country in 2010. Canadian forces were on the ground within 24 hours of that earthquake and provided critical assistance to those in need. They saved thousands of lives and set the stage for other international partners to save thousands more. Canada was at the forefront of NATO's efforts to protect Libyan citizens, enforce a no-fly zone and an arms embargo under the auspices of a UN Security Council resolution. And our men and women in uniform were instrumental in attacking the Gaddafi regime's command and control infrastructure and ensuring that a madman, a maniacal leader, would no longer threaten his citizens with violence. And because of the determination in all of these instances, Canadian forces made a real difference with our international partners and our allies. Ladies and gentlemen, when Canadians go abroad, Canadians do make a difference. And that's why there is a demand for more Canada in the world today. And so, with that as a backdrop, I'm proud to announce to you today the Canadian government has made the decision to task a frigate to NATO's Operation Active Endeavour in the central Mediterranean. Her Majesty's Canadian ship, HMCS Vancouver, originally deployed as part of Operation Unified Protector, will remain in the Mediterranean until early 2012, where she will then be relieved by HMCS Charlottetown, who were previously deployed to the same region. Commanded by Commander Bradley Peets, HMCS Vancouver will be tasked, while on Operation Active Endeavour, to take part in such events as locating, tracking, reporting, boarding vessels of interest suspected of international terrorism. The Royal Canadian Navy will remain a presence in the Mediterranean Sea until the end of 2012. Mesdames et Messieurs, le navire canadien de Sa Majesté NCSM Vancouver, commandé par Bradley Peets et initialement déployé dans le cadre de l'opération Unified Protector, demeure dans les eaux méditerranéennes jusqu'au début de 2012. pour être ensuite remplacés par la NCSM Charlottetown. Les navires de la Marine royale canadienne demeureront dans la mer Méditerranée jusqu'à la fin de 2012 pour prendre part de l'opération Active Endeavour dans le cadre de la lutte contre le terrorisme menée par l'OTAN dans la région. Je suis fier de ce que nos forces canadiennes ont accompli dans cette mission comme les autres missions, et je suis certain, je suis convaincu que la communauté internationale sont très fiers de notre effort aussi. In conclusion, this forum has permitted excellent discussions, a pertinent and timely discussion on many issues that will affect our time and affect our future. Now our men and women in the uniform are putting things that we talked about here that are in theory into practice. And that's why Canadians, in my view, are much more informed and outwardly appreciative and affectionate of the efforts of the men and women in uniform in the Canadian Forces. People like Major General Charlie Bouchard and the pilots and members of the Royal Canadian Navy that took part in Operation Unified Protector. As a country, we don't just talk the talk, we walk the walk. Canada's effort in the Mediterranean came at a critical time when the eyes of the world were on the tensions and the escalated violence in places like Syria and throughout the region. And we know that our men and women are needed to help advance international security and stability. Having a frigate in the Mediterranean, in my view, is a signal to our allies that Canada continues its leadership role on the world stage. Canadian Forces members are again making our country proud. And Peter, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your vision and your leadership, as I mentioned, and your commitment and dedication, for your tireless efforts in making this forum a reality and making this a place where these discussions can occur. You've made this conference better every year. Your team and the team at National Defence and the team here at ACOA in Halifax and throughout Atlantic Canada have done an exceptional job. And each and every year this forum does get better. So I salute you for what you and your team have achieved. I thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Minister. We're now ready for your questions. Please raise your hand, signal your interest, and I'll bring the microphone over to you.
Steve Putticombe from CBC. Two things, your reaction to Egypt today, and what is Canada prepared to do in terms of Syria? There's been a lot of discussion over the weekend.
Yeah, very pertinent questions given the discussion. The situation in Egypt is troubling. It's at the same time symptomatic of the challenge that still exists in Egypt and to the same extent in other countries, including Libya, as they make the transition to a more democratic, inclusive process. Egypt, Libya, others have to be encouraged to make this transition in a peaceful way. I think there is some nervousness about the fact that it is in fact the military that are still controlling much of this process, and people are reacting with some impatience and in some cases with some degree of activism in the streets. And so the international community is going to continue to watch this very closely, but I think what we need to do is demonstrate outreach and support for this peaceful transition that we hope is going to occur in the near future. They're setting election dates, and that is the next goal post that we have to get past. On the second part of your question on Syria, again, the images that we are seeing in Syria are troubling in the extreme, as is the reporting out of that country that the government, the leadership, continue to demonstrate, as we've seen in other countries, a willingness to use their military against their citizens. And one of the more positive developments, if I can put it that way, is the leadership and the leaning forward of the Arab League, the suspension of Syria, the deadlines that have now been set and passed will require, I suspect, further action. And we are working in concert with our allies, working in concert with many of the leaders and leaders that we have worked with in the past in places like Jordan, the UAE, and their commentary and quite frankly their advice will be sought as Canada and other countries contemplate our next step.
Thanks. We're just going to pass the microphone along so everybody can get it in the feed.
I'm wondering how much of the decision to keep a ship in the Mediterranean has to do with situations like Syria and the eventuality of a decline in countries like that.
There's no question that that's weighing heavy on our mind. The primary purpose is to contribute to anti-terrorist operations in the region, but there is no question having a ship in the region in the event that Canadians need direct assistance or evacuation gives us that utility, gives us that capability to respond should certain things transpire. But our primary purpose is to contribute internationally. Its secondary purpose is for retasking, and that includes, as we've seen in the past, in the same region, the ability to retask, to participate in World Vision food delivery, as we saw off the coast of Africa in previous missions.
Thanks, Minister. A question in French.
Sophie des Hôtels, j'aimerais que vous répondiez à la même question, c'est-à-dire quelle est la position du Canada et votre position sur ce qui se passe d'abord en Égypte et ensuite en Syrie.
La position du Canada est maintenant d'entendre les actions de Ligue arabe et de travailler ensemble avec le leadership dans la région pour supporter le peuple sur le terrain en Égypte, et c'est la même chose en Syrie. Mais c'est clair, les progrès en Égypte continuent maintenant, mais ce n'est pas dans le défi. Il y a un défi pour la transition, pour trouver la piste et pour trouver un système démocratique. Mais je crois que les élections arrivent bientôt et j'espère cette réalisation donner la stabilité pour la région. En Syrie, on a continué de monitorer la situation. On avait certaines étapes nécessaires. Les étapes, par exemple, on fait des Arab League. C'est tellement important. Comme les autres conflits, les efforts de Ligue arabe et les leaderships dans la région, dans mon opinion, est absolument nécessaire. Donc, on a continué de travailler ensemble avec les communautés internationales et particulièrement dans le leadership dans la région.
Thank you. We'll take a couple more questions.
Minister Todd Battis, CTV. With Russia and China both set against economic sanctions, and you mentioned yesterday that Libya is no template for Syria, and there seems to be some concern with what could be a long drawn-out process where the military would be involved in Syria. What options does it give countries like Canada?
Well, let's be clear. China and Russia have indicated a reluctance before and come around to the realization that the world can't stand by when humanitarian crisis and slaughter of innocent people is happening inside the region, inside any country for that matter. And so while we weigh and calculate very carefully consideration around interventions in any country because of respect for sovereignty, there is, as you know, as outlined in certain doctrines at the United Nations, a moral obligation. And that has now been very much solidified in recent events and also very much indoctrinated into most countries' views of this situation. What will happen is we will watch very closely. And I think that it's fair to say that a lot of dictators are on notice that this type of behavior is not going to be tolerated. Now, how we go about it and what comes next is done on a, some would call it an escalating scale before making any final decisions around intervention. But other sanctions do exist, And those members of the Security Council that need convincing will be given more information before a final pronouncement will be made. And we're just not there yet, is how I would describe it.
Minister Lee Berthiaume, Post Media News. For the last 3 days, of course, Syria has been a topic of discussion amongst the delegates here, some of the brightest thinkers, some of the highest level officials from different countries, and yet it doesn't seem we're any closer to figuring out what to do. Is that a failure of I guess how would you respond to those who would look at that as with disappointment?
Well, you know, I agree with you. With all of the brain power that we had in this building in the last 72 hours, I didn't hear anybody say, let's charge into Syria. What I heard was, let's contemplate the next move very cautiously, knowing, as I described it in the vernacular, that if you break it, you own it. And, you know, we've seen, Egypt was discussed earlier here a moment ago, that the transition, even when it happens as it did in Tunisia, is still a challenge. Even when it happens suddenly, completely organically inside a country, it is still a challenge. So I think the multinational commitment to work together both before and after is key to the success of a peaceful transition. And we're going to weigh all of those options and work in concert, in lockstep, with the international community. What's missing here is clear. We don't have a United Nations Security Council resolution, and that to me is a necessity in this instance.
Thanks, Minister. This will be your final question.
Minister Melanie Patton, Canadian Press. You said yesterday, like Syria, in terms of intervention in Iran, we're not there yet, but I'm wondering if it does come to that, if action is launched, will Canada at this point make a commitment to being involved in that?
Well, the Prime Minister had comments on that yesterday, and what I'll say is this. Iran, because of their further nuclear aspirations, are on thin ice, but it puts all of us on thin ice. And the consequences there are almost too dark to contemplate as to the implications for a nuclearized Iran or a situation where it becomes absolutely imminent. And again, the eyes of the world are very much on Iran. They know it. There are other steps that can be taken, and the last step is military intervention. So when I say we're not there yet, we're simply not at that point. Thank you, Minister. Thank you.